Job centre staff have been hurt by their depiction. Our debate: are we a less compassionate society? Kathy, let me start with you. You know, this film has attracted a lot of attention. Has it made you think, perhaps, that we need to be more compassionate?
Well, it's confirmed my view that the state does treat people like numbers, as indeed Ken says, but equally he doesn't look at how this has come to happen and why the state has come to play such a big role in people's lives. And this extraordinary expansion of a welfare state that was a social security system once into an entitlement state. So I think it is a piece of very one-dimensional left-wing propaganda which very unfairly targets one party, one man. It does it in the film too, without understanding at all how we've come to this situation that you have literally something like up to 2 million lone parent families, state dependent, 90% of whom are single mothers, whom are being paid for by taxpayers. I mean, there is no public money, it is taxpayers. And it's not easy for the people in the job centres either. So this is very unidimensional. We have changed from a system of social security to an entitlement benefit system. He doesn't address why that's happened, what the trends are, or what we could do about those trends.
Let me pick up on a couple of your points with Micheline. Left-wing propaganda and an entitlement benefit society.
Yeah. I have to say I see it very, very differently. Having been somebody who's had some interaction with the benefit system most of my life, I've seen an enormous change in my lifetime. I think what has changed is the circumstances in which people live. The cost of housing, for example, the low pay, the difficulty in getting work at all, the fact that this idea that there is one group of people who are on benefits and another separate group of people who pay tax is a complete misnomer. It's a complete misdirection of what's actually happening. Most of those people who are using benefits either are currently paying tax and working or will do. You know, very often it's only for a short.
So do you think he's got the tone right with this film?
I think he's absolutely got the tone right, and he's the first person who has been able to put the story from the side of the people who are on the sharp end of it.
Tom, one of the issues brought up with, obviously, Daniel Brake is the position vulnerable people are put in. And without going too much into a debate about means testing, is it fair to put vulnerable people through so much monitoring, do you think?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that the nature of how arbitrary a lot of these restrictions are, which is something that the film looks at, you know, the point where he's assessed and he scores, I think it's 12 points rather than 15. There is something about this which is ultimately dehumanising. But I do think we need a bit of a broader perspective here. I think that there's been this obsession with welfare, both on left and right, for a good while now. And I think that's really come at the cost of actually trying to look at how you can lift people out of poverty, how they can actually take control over their own lives. So you have the right, which likes to kind of like pose as if it's cutting welfare and really it's doing very little. And then you have the left, which seems to be kind of myopically obsessed with it, to the extent where I think it's kind of given up on the idea of making sure that people are in work, can self-determine, and started to treat more and more people as vulnerable, rather than assuming that people should be in control of their own lives.
Jack, what do you make of the idea that the left has given up on the idea of putting people into work?
Well, I would argue that that's not true. I mean, the left are the group of people, to use left broadly, who are campaigning for a living wage. We talk about solutions for people in poverty, but actually 70% of new housing benefit claims are claimed by people who are currently in work. So there's not a group of people who are claiming benefits and a group of people who are working. There is a huge crossover between the two: child tax credits, working tax credits, housing benefit, child benefit. A lot of that is paid to people who are actually in work, have been in work, or will be in work in the future. So there aren't these two separate groups of people, one paying for the other. There's a huge crossover.
But isn't that the problem? Because the state now, we have a £217 billion welfare and tax credits bill. Tax credits are basically benefits, and they're not tax tax credits. The state has, there are 4/5 of families caught up in this churn, and that is fundamentally wrong, because once they're caught up in this churn, aspiration goes and everybody's trapped in it. So not many reforms have, but the idea of no reform is just not an answer. There are problems with disability assessment that are clearly not right, but far too many people are being lumped into a welfare system, partly because it is no longer a contributory system, and in other countries there's an assumption you pay in before you take out.
It's an entitlement. I want to bring in Dr. Adam Perkins at this point as well. You've been listening to this argument, and in previous times you've argued that the welfare state has led to a production line of future generations of people relying on benefits. Why do you say that?
Yes, I think it's more a question of incentive. So research shows that our personalities determine how we process incentives. Okay, so the lower we score on a dimension known as conscientiousness, the stronger the incentive we require to go out to work. So what this ends up with is, if we have a system that doesn't take that into account, then we can proliferate unemployment, people who are not going to work when they could go to work. But I think we need less sort of interference at the benefit office stage, and just a simpler system that triages people, because most unemployed people, by definition, have an average personality profile. And so just need an arm around their shoulder, just a bit of encouragement to go back to work. And then people at the lower end of the conscientiousness scale, which is about 16% of the population, need more of a stronger incentive to go to work.
Jack, comments on personalities there. People on benefits or claimants, job claimants, have different personalities.
Well, yes, we all have very different personalities. I mean, I think that we just heard there was a very long-winded way of saying that we're all homogenous, lazy scroungers. And actually, I'm struggling not to go full Hulk over here, but that's offensive and puerile.
Adam, I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I just said we differ on our personality, so we're not all super conscientious. Some of us are less conscientious than others. So treating everybody, the welfare state would work great if everybody was conscientious, because we'd only use it when we had to, and as soon as a job came along, even if it was below our qualification level, we'd grab it, just because we're conscientious. That's what being conscientious means.
Okay, Jack.
Okay, I'm conscientious. I was employed. I worked for the fire service, and when I had a child and could no longer work for the fire service because of the shift systems, I applied for over 300 jobs before I was a local newspaper journalist. I applied to be parking attendant, I applied to clean cafes, I applied to clean trains, I applied to do every single job at the job centre, things that I was overqualified for. And I'm a conscientious person, and I ended up almost homeless, starving, on the breadline, and you're lumping me into some personality trait that you're saying that actually that I was hungry because I'm lazy, because I'm not conscientious, because I didn't try hard enough. And sorry, but don't rewrite my life experiences for me.
I've gone through the same thing. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I couldn't get a job. It was back in the early 90s. There was a dearth of graduate level jobs. I was on the dole. I was in and out of labouring jobs. Spent 2.5 years working in a clothing warehouse doing quality control.
So how can you talk like that about people when you claim to have had the same experiences? How can you then discount and discard them?
No, I'm just saying we need a bit more of a nudge if we're less conscientious. And so if we go back to Beveridge's report, Social Insurance and Allied Services, he knew this. So the original Beveridge vision of the welfare state was highly nuanced.
Okay.
It was a tightrope between providing a safety net but not encouraging idleness. And he actually advocated workfare, page 58, if you want to read it.
We can't go through every page of that, but thanks very much. And then Micheline, it kind of brings up the idea of how perhaps the media portrays people who are involved in the benefits system. Is it fair?
Calling people on you who need to use benefits, people with a lack of conscientiousness is outrageous. And it's predicated on this idea that the entire world is full of middle-class, white, able-bodied men who can go and do labouring jobs and do all these sort of things if you know, to make ends meet and go and live in a single room somewhere and pay a minimal amount of rent, or stay at home with their mums, which is what they mostly do, in order to get past. I just find it infuriating. I've been, you know, of course, the media are trying, in fact, the whole system is trying to make it look like it's not working because of our failings. We're the cause of everything, because we're just not good enough.
Yeah.
And there is no recognition that it's the policies which have put people in these positions. Look at that programme, Daniel Blake. This was a man who worked all his life and had a heart attack. I know many people like that because they work too hard. And they're, you know, the stress has actually killed them in the end. And you dare to call us people with a lack of conscientiousness.
Tom.
I think we need to take a lot of the moralism out of this debate, insofar as it's often set up as it's between the kind of deserving poor on one side and the scroungers on the other. I don't really think that's what's going on. And I think the big problem, though, is that, and particularly coming from the left of the political spectrum, is that there is this tendency to treat everyone as if they're kind of in need of some form of support. That orientation, that aspiration towards people being self-reliant is almost absolutely evaporated. And I think that's ultimately a big problem. The left used to talk about full employment, used to talk about how anyone, no matter their ability level, what disability they might have, should have an opportunity to get into work, because that's how you're a part of society. And yet I think the issue around disabilities, which is obviously very much in the news this week, is an interesting one, insofar as the conversation is constantly about work capability assessments, whereas the sort of programmes you saw in the wake of the Second World War, where it was in terms of wounded soldiers or civilians with disabilities, there were programmes to make sure that they could be trained. There was this idea that being working and self-reliant as much as you possibly could was a good thing. And I don't see that in any of the description. It feels like the left wants to treat people as
both
victims.
the right and the left actually have taken away the wherewithal from families to do it for themselves, because it takes two people to rear a family. There was a sense of entitlement. Interestingly, in that film, the girl, the single mother, did show a sense of entitlement that nobody's questioned. She didn't question why her two different fathers of her children weren't supporting her. Neither
Are you
did
making
the
a
other
moral
man.
judgment there?
Well, in a way, I'm making a cultural judgment. Our society has developed a system of creating economically unsustainable families where people have a baby, demand welfare and then look for work. And actually, it's not their individual fault. We've all pushed this culturally since the 1970s or 80s.
OK, let's find out what our viewers are saying about this, because they're definitely going to get as engaged as we all are in this conversation. Let's hear some of your reactions. Tommy, you've been...
Yeah, lots of people at home saying, Naga, that we have changed as a nation. We are less compassionate, and they're blaming the media for vilifying benefit claimants. Dion saying, I think as a society we have become less compassionate. The media spends more time exposing people who are seen as abusing the benefit system and less on large organisations that don't pay corporate taxes. Dave on Facebook says it's all about number one, unfortunately. Society doesn't care much. Helen says, yes, we are selfish. Just look at all the people who think the benefits are some kind of excessive largesse. Nina says, unfortunately, the public seems to have lost sympathy for the vulnerable who depend on the state. And Patricia, finally on our Facebook page, saying, when some learn of MP expenses, claims and bankers' bonuses that go totally unpunished, they think, well, if it's OK for them, it's OK for me. The concept of leading by example is obviously lost on Parliament.
Lots of views there. Micheline, what do you make of those?
Well, I think that's very interesting. I think it seems to me, when you talk about society, it isn't one thing. It's a whole lot of different viewpoints, but the general divide is between people whose interests are in what I would call the owning class, in the people who are benefiting financially from the whole way they've structured our economy, and then there's all the rest of us. And I just want to say one thing that seems crucial to a lot of these arguments about aspiration and standing on your own feet and all the rest of it. When I was much younger, it was possible to do that, because the rents that you were asked to pay, the general cost of living, was something that you could match by your earnings. It was possible to do it. It is no longer possible to do it. I have a daughter who is also disabled. I live in social housing and I pay a quarter of the rent she is being asked to pay. There is no difference between us and our needs or anything else. All that is changed is that there's no more social housing. And I think many of these difficulties go back to that.
So have we, Kathy, then become harder on people than we used to?
I think it's hard to say. In fact, Britain's a very compassionate country. We give more than anyone else in Europe. The state, by definition, is bureaucratic and treats people as numbers. That's why it's so tragic that the state has taken away so much from families, stopped supporting married families, stopped supporting and encouraging the families that could be self-sustaining. It is very difficult for people to go it on their own and do it on their own. This is very economically expensive. There is no doubt the system that we have is unsustainable. It's got bigger and bigger, caught more and more people up in it, and I fear that what Ken wants, which is giving it more, will not improve the system. You will get jobs worth working in the state system. The food bank was an absolute excellent example of community at work.
Time's tight. Tom, quick reaction.
Well, I just think that we need to get away from this kind of very simple debate we're having about this. Now, I think the big problem with the welfare...
Worth having the debate.
It's definitely worth having the debate, but we've got to have it on a broader scale. I think that the problem with the welfare state is you effectively have this huge Byzantine bureaucracy that is charged with looking after poor people without ever looking at how you can create jobs, how you can build more housing. I think the state is doing too much and too little.
Quick word, Jack.
Quickly, when people talk about solutions, well, it would be cheaper for the government, for Parliament, to go after the large-scale employers who insist on paying poverty wages, because my taxes that I pay top up, and I won't name them, but large corporations who pay a minimum wage, and then people go out to work and have to claim benefits in order to top that up. So if those people actually paid wages people could live on, the welfare bill would reduce drastically. So go after the bad people and not the people struggling to make ends meet.
It's a thought I'm going to end this conversation on. Just time always goes against us. Thank you so much for your comments. It's certainly got you talking. Thank you. Thank you for talking to us. Keep them coming in.